This is Glasgow University, founded in 1450 before Columbus had found America. In the 18th century, John Hunter was teaching anatomy in the Glasgow Medical School, where some 60 Americans graduated in medicine that century. In 1860, Lister established antiseptic surgery in Glasgow, and his pupil Magoun began operating on the brain and spinal cord in 1879, when Harvey Cushing was still a schoolboy. These are the new buildings at Glasgow, dating from that time 112 years ago. Magoun more than once declined an invitation to take the foundation chair of surgery at Johns Hopkins, eventually filled by Halstead, whose resident Cushing was to become. A century later, the new buildings of the Institute of Neurological Sciences were opened by Wilder Penfield of the Montreal Neurological Institute. It's placed in the grounds of an 1870s general hospital. The institute includes neurosurgical and neurology beds and laboratories, its own theatre suite and intensive care unit, neuroradiology complex, and neuropathology. Presently being added here is the spinal injuries unit for Scotland, which is being moved from Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Very difficult. Bryan, your name is clearly associated with Glasgow, but at the time you came here in 1963, you'd already obviously done your training and you'd written your textbook in neurosurgery and you'd worked in Oxford and Manchester and you'd been to America. So I think, could you start by telling us something of the early years and how you came into neurosurgery in the first place?
Well, I was an undergraduate in Liverpool. I'd been evacuated up there during the war from London. And Liverpool was famous for orthopedic surgery. That's where Thomas invented his splint, and Watson Jones was another figure. And I was determined to be an orthopedic surgeon. It seemed to me the only sensible thing to do. But like you, I had second thoughts about orthopedic surgery and came, in fact, under the influence of Henry Cohen, who was a legendary general physician with an interest in neurology. And he was a spellbinding lecturer and orator. I was mesmerized by the logic of neurology. But I sort of felt that diagnosis without action wasn't very fulfilling. So I thought surgery is still for me, and neurosurgery seemed the natural place to go, what I've since sometimes called the thinking man's surgery.
So, I mean, at that stage, would you say you had found a role model, I mean, in Liverpool, or was that yet to come in terms of neurosurgery?
Well, yes, at that time, and we're talking about 1949, 1950, there were three, I suppose, outstanding neurosurgeons in Britain, namely Cairns in Oxford, Jefferson in Manchester, and Dott in Edinburgh. They had all been with Cushing. They had all, of course, been general surgeons who had gradually started doing neurosurgery on Sundays and gradually sort of built up their specialty. And I got an introduction to Cairns, really quite by chance, but that took me to Oxford, where I was his houseman and stayed in Oxford for some time.
And that was the time, of course, when doctors had to do their military service, so I think you were sort of entangled in that at that particular time.
Well, that's right. I mean, at that stage, which was the time of the Korean War and the occupation of Germany, it was everybody had to go in for 2 years, and it was just a question whether you went in the day you qualified or whether you could put it off for a bit, which I managed to do. Did 6 months with Cairns, but he had been brigadier in charge of neurosurgery during the war, so he had a good deal of influence and saw that I was posted to the head injuries hospital at Wheatley, which was in effect an extension of his unit in Oxford. So I gained more neurosurgical and head injury experience really during my military service.
I mean, so you also, I think, when you were there, met and were sort of influenced by Walpole Lewin. I mean, was this at that time or later on?
No. When I came back from the army, I then went back into the Oxford unit and was there for 2 or 3 years. And at that time, of course, all the neurosurgeons who'd been away in the army were all coming back, of which Lewin was one, Gillingham in Edinburgh was another. These people had all been running these mobile neurosurgical units. Of course, it's interesting, Cairns probably had his best years as brigadier in the army, organizing everything. And Cushing, of course, likewise had a great time in World War I and advanced his standing and the standing of neurosurgery by the lessons of war, so to speak. And Cairns was, in a way, reenacting this. So Lewin was one of those. So yes, I did meet Lewin, who was running then the accident service in Oxford, which was a combined orthopedic neurosurgical service, which I suppose was one of the first sort of comprehensive services dealing with head injuries and so on in civilian life.
And then I think when you were training in Oxford, but you also went to Cardiff and Manchester, and I mean, was that part of the training program, as it were? How were things arranged?
Well, of course, unlike the American system and perhaps the continental system, where you go in man and boy in the one unit and become the son of the boss, as you know, in Britain, people had to move around to get the next job, get the promotion. So I'd really done my time in Oxford. There was no obvious immediate future there. So I went to Oxford, to Cardiff rather, for 18 months, and then to Manchester. So I got a pretty varied and even disturbingly varied experience, because these places ran very different sorts of show. And I always remember Richard Johnson, who was the man who succeeded Jefferson in Manchester, saying to me, neurosurgery is saying the world over. And I thought, my God, it isn't. You wouldn't recognize it if you looked here and in Oxford.
I mean, would you say that, I mean, at that time, as compared with the American sort of system whereby people go with one particular school, I mean, what would you like to comment on the advantages, the disadvantages, a little more?
Well, I think that, of course, there are some units in Britain that I think have tended to train up their own men in their own image. I think Edinburgh was one in Dot's day, and I think Wiley McKissock in London was another. And you said you could always tell people trained by these people by the style of their work. I felt it was positively advantageous to see that what one unit said, if you don't do this, all the patient will die or dire consequences, then I'd see the very opposite being done. And so that really seeded my interest in what I suppose now is called variations in surgical practice, the fact that there are different ways of doing it, and that I suppose started my interest in management and in the different ways in which things can be done.
I mean, this leads on really to the issue of your book, the Introduction to Neurosurgery. I mean, how was that born? Was that come out of that did that emerge from this look at different ways of handling the same problem?
Well, I think partly. I think also I was struck by the fact that a lot of other surgeons and physicians had cases coming to neurosurgery. They would also, as junior staff, come and work in neurosurgery, and that something was needed not just for the budding neurosurgeon, but for the house officer in surgery and medicine and accident and so on. So I tried deliberately to make this at a level that was of interest or would be comprehensible to them, and indeed I'm just doing the 5th edition now, so it's stood the test of time.
And then you obtained the qualification that at that time we sort of all felt we had to have, the BTA, the Been to America. Tell us about your trip to America. And
well, yes, I was, Jefferson helped to organize this, and I was supposed to go and work with Denny Brown in Boston, but it turned out that wasn't possible, and I got, as a consolation prize, going to work with Magoun and French in Los Angeles. Everyone said, of course, Los Angeles, that's terrible. I wouldn't go if I were you. But we went as a Rockefeller Fellow and spent a great year there, mostly in the laboratories, but also keeping in touch with neurosurgery through Gene Stern. And at the sort of end of that period, gave a paper at the Cushing in New Orleans. And that was the beginning of my American experience, if you like, which has continued to the present day.
I mean, although you spent most of the time, you're saying, in the laboratory, and there are a number of very frequently referred to papers that attest to that. But also, what about the practice and the training of neurosurgery in American life? I mean, I think you also had some comments on that. I seem to recall you having given a talk in the BBC when you came back about your time in America.
Well, yes. I mean, it obviously, California was an interesting experience in itself. I mean, never wearing a tie or a coat for a year, and I think that the thing that struck me there was the sort of insecurity of medical life from the point of view of the doctor, and of course, I was, like everybody, tempted to stay, and would I not stay? And in fact, when I came to Glasgow, it was as a direct choice between that or going back to Los Angeles. I never have any doubt that I did the right thing, but that's easy to say now.
Well, that, in a sense, brings us back to Glasgow, and certainly a place that was different from Los Angeles, as you've said, and different from Manchester, and certainly from Oxford, I would say. What, at the time when you first arrived in Glasgow, I mean, what did you see as the, if you like, the assets and the challenges when you got there?
Well, the neurosurgical service in Glasgow, as most services probably at that time in Britain, were very much practical, get on and do the job, no academic pretensions, no time. Indeed, there were people who said that if you time for academic work, it showed that you didn't have enough real work to do. So it was against that kind of background that I was actually hired by the professor of surgery, Sir Charles Illingworth, who was a great proponent of research in clinical surgery, to try and realize the academic potential as he saw it. Of course, many general surgeons saw the specialties as a threat to general surgery and were the last people to encourage specialties, but he was not in that mold. So I came as a health service job, not an academic job, but with some sessions. And I had never been in Scotland before as far as medicine was concerned. It seemed a very strange land to me. I thought I would be the only Englishman here, but there were quite a few refugees, actually. And it was in an old army hospital out in the country, as you will remember. In fact, before I came, somebody said, "You're going to Siberia." But it proved not to be quite as harsh as that. But there was a lot to do, let's put it that way, in building up the unit to a different style, trying to develop academic interests and so on.
I mean, I well remember the time of your arrival, and there were other people that sort of stood out in different sort of areas that I think you quickly linked with. Murray Harper and Gordon McDowell, Ian Leddingham. I remember. How did you sort of first, as it were, come into contact with them and begin what was, of course, to prove a very fruitful relationship? Well,
I think I had, as I say, been brought in by the professor of surgery. Not all the neurosurgeons were all that welcoming. I mean, they didn't see why this chap should be coming in from outer space with this rather peculiar remit of doing other things than simply getting the day's work done. And of course, it was natural that within that kind of academic surgical fraternity, there was Murray Harper, who was doing, beginning to develop cerebral blood flow measurements with xenon as a sidetrack of the heart surgery program. Ian Leddingham was running the pressure chamber, but again, oxygen to the brain is one of the names of the game, and it was natural that we would come together. Gordon McDowell, anesthesia. Well, I've always said that anaesthetists are the closest of the other specialties to the neurosurgeon, much more important than neurologists. And we very quickly found that there was a lot of common interest.
I mean, certainly what sort of led from that, as I would see it, I mean, there were a number of interlocking threads, but certainly there was the work on intracranial pressure that started at that time, and I wonder if you'd just like to expand on that a wee bit.
We're now talking about 1966 or so, when we in fact started measuring intracranial pressure in the operating theatre by lumbar puncture, looking at the effect of anesthesia, of different anesthetic agents, nitrous oxide, halothane and so on, and discovering that halothane greatly raised intracranial pressure in patients who'd already got a space-occupying lesion. And indeed, McDowell and I published our first 2 cases in the Journal of Neurosurgery in 1967, and then in the Lancet a couple of years later, dealing with several other agents. And I think that had quite an impact on neuroanesthesia. I think people used to think, well, was there some toxic component in halothane that made patients go bad after halothane? But of course, it was a very simple mechanical event. And of course, that tied up with the blood flow measurements in the animal experiments, because we knew that this was all because of vasodilatation. So in a way, what we were beginning to establish then was, I think, an interesting program of looking at things in the clinic and then looking at things in the laboratory, and then quite quickly, I mean, within the year, coming back and often having the same equipment in the laboratory as in the clinic, and the same individuals. And I think that was a strength, rather than having a basic science lab miles away or something like that.
I mean, one can see in the intracranial pressure work the spin-off there was for anesthesia, but I think also you and Ian Johnson and Jane Johnson wrote a paper that again was really very widely quoted for a long time on just the use of intracranial pressure monitoring.
That's right, yes, that was 1970, but looking back over the last 4 years, in head injury. And I always remember at that time, my impression, for example, going around the States at that time, was that everyone was trying to develop a new gadget. Everyone would open a drawer and say, have you seen this new little gadget I've got? But they'd never done any measurements with it. It was all technological development, whereas we very simply did interventricular measurements with a catheter and did lots of patients and looked at phenomena. And it seemed to me that was, from a practical surgeon's point of view, perhaps a more useful approach than trying to develop new technologies.
Yes, I mean, I certainly think one of the statements that came out of that, which was probably of more value than many, many other things, was the statement that if the pressure was low, it was important to know about it so that you didn't need to give treatment, and the hazards that would involve. Well, if we go from intracranial pressure, really I'd like to hear a bit more about also cerebral blood flow. We've touched on that already, but in Glasgow was one of the very first places where the methods that were developed in the experimental laboratory were applied in man. And would you just like to say, because you
yes,
were
I think
associated with that?
We developed the xenon, or we didn't develop the xenon method, we applied it in the clinic, and particularly in carotid ligation, and you were working with me at that time, and you remember we were measuring the actual effects of clamping in conscious patients, measuring the blood flow, and evolving criteria for the risk of hemiplegia. And I think that was an interesting application of, in a very practical way. And I remember it once being on the BBC in Tomorrow's World, which is still running as a sort of whiz kid, look at these marvellous things that people are doing, and it was physicists in the operating theatre. Of course, at the end of the day, I don't think clinical blood flow measurements have been as useful as we hoped. On the other hand, in the laboratory, in the animals, we discovered a great deal about the mechanisms of intracranial pressure, its control, and so on. And I think some of our important work came out of those experiments, which you were involved with, Johnson and Rowan, showing the different relationships, what happened, how to control it, and also about the sympathetic control of the blood flow. And of course, at that time, we often had help in the laboratory for 6 months or a year at a time from visiting people, particularly from America and Australia, who would come to our unit to work, and there were quite a few of them.
That's right. I think Julian Hoff was one of the people I remember who was being asked to look at the sympathetic control.
That's right.
If you recall.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, there was him and Robert Grossman, Larry Pitts, Larry Marshall, Gary Ferguson, John Girvan. These were all people who, you spoke about the BTA, they had their BTG, been to Glasgow.
I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, if you were asked to look in the sort of practical way at intracranial pressure monitoring and measurement of cerebral blood flow, I mean, what do you think has had the biggest impact practically?
Well, I
in
think
the neurosurgical
there's no doubt the
clinic?
intracranial pressure has yielded more in practical day-to-day terms. On the other hand, I've always been a great believer in saying that you may use one of these invasive investigations as a means of finding out and understanding better what goes on. You don't then need to go on measuring the pressure. For example, we don't go on measuring the pressure under anesthesia.
Yeah.
We've learnt the lesson, we've changed our practice. And I think it's quite interesting now that quite a number of places are abandoning intracranial pressure measurements in head injuries and so on, not because it was no use, but because the lessons have been learnt, and it may not be necessary in a day-to-day, case-by-case necessary, or at least people will balance the burdens and benefits, say they don't think it's quite worth the trouble, the risks and so on.
Right.
I think that's still a debatable point, but I think the fact that one isn't using it every day doesn't mean that it wasn't right to use it in order to acquire knowledge and move ahead.
We've talked really about techniques of measurement. In a sense, that really leads us to the issue of head injury as a sort of clinical topic, with which your name, more than any other, I think, of the clinical areas in neurosurgery, your name will always be associated. Would you like to sort of, as it were, start at the beginning specifically for head injury and really take us through the interest in head injury, epilepsy related to head injury, prognosis of head injury and so forth? How did it start?
Well, I think that an interest in head injury was a natural for someone who'd started training in Oxford. The Cairns influence, the post-war cases there, the interest of Lewin in the civilian injuries. So, for example, the epilepsy, there had been very good studies during the war of epilepsy after gunshot wounds. And it seemed to me a natural to say, well, what about it in civilian life? So in a way, that was directly derivative from that. Similarly, during the war, there was a lot of work on the head injuries, very good documentation and so on. In civilian life, of course, cases were nothing like as well looked after, because, of course, you can't give people orders and put them on a charger they don't obey. And I think that, therefore, there was a natural springboard. But I've always been much more interested in common conditions than uncommon conditions. It's often seen to me that there's most to be gained by changing practice in relation to common conditions, which are often ignored by people who are away looking at the thing that only happens occasionally but is fascinating. So perhaps that was natural. But then Joe Pennybacker, who was, of course, the American partner of Cairns in Oxford, the Tennessee chap who never went back when he came over here to do his medical course in Edinburgh, because the statue of James Y. Simpson was apparently in the town square where he was in Tennessee, and he said, I must go to Edinburgh. However, he said to me, when you go to a strange town like Glasgow was to me then, you look after the head injuries and they'll look after you. And it was very true. I mean, very few neurosurgeons were interested in head injuries then, and for sure the other surgeons weren't interested. So they were very much a kind of neglected area that everybody felt uncomfortable about. And it gave an opportunity for developing liaison with other surgeons, with anaesthetists, obviously. In fact, I think the first paper I wrote after I came to Glasgow was called Head Injuries and the Anaesthetist. We were, as you know, out 16 miles in the country, people were being transported in ambulances. Well, you know, I wrote a paper last year about the hazards of transport in ambulances. So some of these problems don't go away and they don't get solved by science because they're more to do with common sense and practice.
Before we get on to some of the other issues related to head injury, the business of epilepsy has been seen as important not only by doctors, but also, I mean, we frequently get asked about it by lawyers, and I mean, you published a lot of figures on this, and I just, again, wonder what your thoughts are about this as a sort of source of information and its importance, and how specific you can be about these, you know, rates of epilepsy after certain types of head injury, because lawyers really seem to pin so much on that.
Well, I mean, I started these studies when I was in Oxford, and indeed published my first edition of my monograph in '62 before I came to Glasgow on Manchester and Oxford cases it seemed to me amazing that nobody had found this out before, because it needed no more than a pencil and paper to do. Of course, that was before computers, so I had these stacks of punch cards, and you'll remember when we started looking at depressed fracture, the multi-hole punch cards, you know, those are still there with your writing on them. And so it was my first essay, if you like, into data banks, because you'd now call that a data bank, I suppose, and simply doing very simple 2x2 statistics. And the thing was, the answer was there. I mean, that it was quite obvious that if you'd had an early fit, you had a 30% chance of further fits. But Denny Brown was on record as saying that this was just part of the acute phase and it would all settle down, had nothing to do with epilepsy in the future. And yet the data was there.
Yeah.
Of course, pretty tedious. You had to follow these people up and write to them and so on. But the fact is that we have ended up with a set of figures that seem to have stood the test of time. We have to, of course, update them now that we've got CT scanning, for example. People come and say, what happens if you've got a blood clot on the CT scan? You don't let it out. Do your figures apply? Well, of course they don't. So we've had to redo those. We're looking now at epilepsy after aneurysm surgery because, again, people get very upset if they're told they can't drive a car after an operation. The surgeon gets very upset because he said, my patients don't get epilepsy. Well, I've just about finished a study on that showing that indeed many of them don't, but some of them do. It's very similar to the head injury study. So I think there is useful data by this rather tedious business. Now, of course, it's all in the computer, so you press a button rather than stay up at night with the slide rule, which is what I used to do.
Well, I think the thing that most people, I mean, if we have to pick one thing that your name will forever be associated with, it'll be the Coma Scale. And that, of course, directly comes out of the head injury work. How did that, I mean, what was behind the Coma Scale,
well,
if you like?
I started really looking at severe head injuries and got my first grant in 1968. So that was only 5 years after that paper in the Lancet from Newcastle suggesting that the mortality from severe head injury could be halved by what would now be called intensive care, tracheostomy, chlorpromazine, cooling, and so on. I was struck 5 years later as to how many of these people still died, how many of the survivors were left disabled, and rather deriving from the epilepsy approach, said surely we ought to be able to predict which of these people are worth treating, if you like to put it that way. And so the thing began quite deliberately as an exercise in prediction. Can we predict in severe head injuries early on who are going to do? And we set up this data bank, we got money, we started collecting cases, and it soon became clear that severity of injury was an important thing, and we started with what used to be called the Coma Index. And we just gradually worked it with Ian Johnson. Then Graham Teasdale came as a young, strapping lad and came aboard, and we gradually got this. The nurses, of course, were the people who took to it, and they were the people who spread it around, because they went out, because there were 10 nurses for every doctor in the health service, as you know, so they spread out and said, you know, they've got this thing up there, and they started using it. If we'd asked the doctors, for permission to use it or introduce it, we might never have got there. But it was published in the nursing journals first, and then it was home and dry. And of course, after it was published, and the next year, Michael Bond and I, because I published that with Graham Teasdale, of course, in the Lancet, the next year, the outcome scale with Michael Bond, the psychiatrist, and then Tom Langford gave it a very useful puff in the Journal of Neurosurgery, saying these scales ought to be adopted worldwide so that there would be comparability. And of course, amazingly, that's what actually happened. When we gave a preliminary communication on the Coma Scale at the SBNS in London at Queen Square, I remember John Potter, who was a great head injury neurosurgeon, said, it'll never work. None of these things ever worked during the war, and this won't work any more than any other. But there you are.
Well, I mean, it certainly has worked. But of course, like all things, it's not been without its critics, and there have been criticisms that it's too simple, and there's criticisms that it doesn't have enough subdivisions, that it doesn't describe the cases in quintessential, perfect detail. I mean, how do you respond to people who raise questions like that?
Well, I think there are particularly neurologists, neurosurgeons who like to think the brain's complicated, therefore looking after it ought to be complicated, and feel that if it's simple it can't be right. But of course, if it's too complicated, it doesn't work. And I think it's stood the test of time. Of course, it's not perfect. And of course, people have misinterpreted it and tried to use it in mild cases, or it doesn't tell you the whole story. But of course, as usual, once you launch one of these things, it's a hostage to fortune. People will misuse it or turn it upside down or take the square root of it or something, and then blame you when it doesn't work. So I think that we said it was a practical scale. That was the subtitle in the Lancet, and that was all it ever essayed to be. But of course, people have written PhD theses on it and taken it further than perhaps it should have gone.
Yes, I mean, I certainly feel there's been as many people saying it's too simple and other people saying it's too complicated. It probably means it's just about right. It was I have to admit, a late arrival in Edinburgh. That's probably the last.
Well, I'm glad you said it before I did.
But it's certainly very, very well.
But I think basically it was an attempt to make coma computer compatible. The fact that one had to get something into figures, and that the neurological approach of long-winded descriptions and fancy words and so on were clearly not going to work. So in a way it was forced on us by the need, if you like, to get this data in digital form.
Bryan, you've described how the things led to the interest in prognosis, and I mean, as we saw it, sort of looking on at this work as it developed, one of the issues that seemed to come up quite quickly was prognosis, depending on the severity of head injury, but also head injuries managed in different ways. And would you like to discuss that?
Well, yes, of course. The approach to the prognosis was to develop a data bank on severely head-injured patients, and we started obviously with the cases in Glasgow, and after 2 or 3 years we recruited 2 centres in the Netherlands, from Rotterdam, Brugman, and Groningen, Minderhout. And after a couple of years of that, we then got an NIH grant, partly through Fred Plum, which gave us a centre in Los Angeles for head injuries, but also got non-traumatic comas from the neurologists in Newcastle and Fred Plum. So we were running these in parallel. So the things that emerged from this was that practice differed greatly in different places. For example, the tracheostomy rate varied enormously between different centres in the same country. The ventilation rate, the number of people who had steroids and so on. And yet the outcome of this suggested that when the cases were matched for age and severity, the outcomes were very similar. So that was in itself an interesting finding, but one that suggested that prediction based on severity, age, type of injury might indeed be fairly practical for many cases.
I mean, certainly to, as it were, predicting the course of a head injury, what were you feeling at this stage about the practicalities of actually looking at the influence of management against the backdrop of, I mean, obviously trying to match for these other factors? Was that a practical proposition?
Well, I think, of course, one might have thought the way to do it was to have a trial and prospectively allocate. We purposely were not looking at that because prediction was our name of the game rather than comparing treatments. I suppose we were surprised, if you like, to find that treatments varied so much, but that in itself gave an opportunity to look in a big data bank. So we're now talking about a couple of thousand cases. You could match cases that had been treated similarly and differently and draw some conclusions about the influence. For example, we showed that steroids did not work because exactly 50% of the cases had steroids and 50% didn't. You could match them and show there was no difference, and of course randomized trials subsequently showed that. Sure. So that was another interesting approach to looking at management in a field where I think trials are quite difficult in acutely injured people with life-threatening conditions, but that's perhaps another story. But we did discover this. We later got San Francisco on board because the Americans said Los Angeles was a very funny place. Why on earth did you pick them? So right, we'll have another. And of course the story was much the same.
And I think the predictions, as I recall, I mean, were pretty powerful. I mean, in terms of people giving you data without telling you the outcome.
Yes.
And then being told
yes.
what it
Right.
should have been.
I think that the predictions, it was relatively easy to predict death, and to predict death earlier than it was absolutely obvious. And I think, however, even as we've increased the data bank, there are still a large number of uncertain cases, what I call the floating voters. And it seems to me they're the ones that one ought to be doing randomized trials of new agents, which is now very much what's coming into head injury. Of course, it's interesting that in all those years, we never had an UK collaborator. We had all these people from abroad. And it's only in the last, in 1986, when you joined us from Edinburgh and Liverpool and Southampton, that we had an actual 4 UK centres looking at this and going over the same ground.
One of the, when one's talked about the patients who die and having prognosis of that, but of course there are a number of cases where it's absolutely essential to have 100% predictors. And is this really the way that the whole issue of brain death criteria emerged? Because this has been one of the contentious topics and was, of course, accelerated by the need to define death at a time when patients' hearts were still beating. I mean, what was the story behind that, Bryan?
Well, I suppose it was inevitable that neurosurgeons became identified with the brain death and the organ transplantation because they were what I call the donor doctors in many cases. And I remember Earl Walker having an editorial on the neurosurgeon's responsibility for organ donation. So I got drawn into this by the transplant surgeons here and then by the colleges and the Department of Health evolving the criteria for brain death. I always emphasize that even if there wasn't organ transplantation, there are still 4,000 brain dead people in Britain every year. And if you don't have criteria, you have to wait for them to decompose from the feet up, which was exactly what used to happen. So we really adopted criteria in the Institute in Glasgow, informally used them for 3 or 4 years, and in effect these were the ones that were eventually virtually adopted by the colleges in 1976. And everything seemed to be going quite smoothly until a bunch of Americans came on British television and said that it just wasn't good enough because we weren't using the EEG in effect. And I was very much involved in this controversy which reached the House of Commons and took over the Lancet and the BMJ and was almost a major international incident. The interesting outshot was that we never changed those criteria, whereas in 1983 the President's Commission in America produced a set of criteria for determining death which were almost a mirror image of the British criteria and emphasized that EEG was not necessary. So it was an interesting story when looked at in retrospect. It was pretty harrowing at the time.
I mean, even not only with the United States, I think there's been similar issues have arisen in Europe, haven't there, with the need to do arteriography or to do certain types of brain scan. But, I mean, where do you stand with those arguments?
We always took the point very clearly that this was a clinical diagnosis that could be reliably made, that it didn't even require a neurosurgeon, that, you know, anaesthetist physicians in intensive care units, this is a fairly straightforward issue. But, I mean, we actually made a film for the BBC to respond to the first one, and in that regard I went to New York with the BBC and had Fred Plum and Bill Sweet both on television talking to me and saying yes, it was all right, that's what they'd always thought over there really, and that these other guys, the EEG merchants, they didn't believe in them either. But there are still, as you rightly say, as of this day, people who say you need people now are saying you need PET scanning, that you MRI is the answer. And of course, it's totally impractical, even in the American scene, to say difficult enough to get these things done in the living patients, never mind the dead ones.
I think let's come back now from the, I mean, we've talked about the very severely injured and of course the fatalities. Let's come back to the less severely injured and the problems that the young doctor, if you like, faces in the casualty department of the hospital. I mean, you've been interested in this area as well, haven't you?
Well, yes. I mean, way back in 1975, we wrote a paper with the pathologists, myself, Hugh Adams, David Graham, and Riley from Australia, on what we called patients who talk and die. And it became clear that avoidable deaths after head injury were seldom up in the very severe end of the trade. They were the cases who came in often talking, got sent home by the casualty officer, developed a hematoma and came back too late to save. And we really pursued this notion, and in fact wrote a paper in '77 with Jim Rose from Texas, who was with us then, on avoidable deaths from head injury, and we're still studying that, still studying the talk and dies. And I think that leads into how are these people coped with at the front door, where there are, you know, just hundreds of these people arriving every week, of which only one is going to develop a hematoma. So we began looking systematically at what are the criteria, what's the importance of skull fracture, and we got into no end of trouble with the radiologists who, on both sides of the Atlantic, were saying it's all a waste of time x-raying the skull, it doesn't matter if you just look at the patient properly. And of course they've been proved wrong. In fact, a fracture increases the risk that you will develop a hematoma by an enormous number of times. And we have only this year published our latest paper on the risk factors, worked out statistically, and giving guidelines for people in A&E who should have a skull x-ray, who should have a CT scan, who should be admitted for observation, but all really aimed at detecting the patient with the intracranial hematoma, which is still the chief avoidable killer. You know, forget all the aggressive internal intensive care and so on. Most of the avoidable deaths are in these walking wounded.
This, obviously nowadays, the issue of plain x-rays of the skull, some might say, well, you know, is really a dead issue in most countries. And what is now at issue is the use of the CT scanner. And I know that you and Peter McPherson have recently looked at the use of the CT scan in this respect. I wonder what are your feelings about that?
Well, I think
now?
There is no doubt that the skull fracture was only an indication that this patient might develop a hematoma. The CT scan tells you whether they have got a hematoma. So there's no doubt that the CT scan, if available, is a very useful maneuver. However, the interesting thing is, and I did some studies when I was in Houston recently, is that only a minority of patients coming, even in these high-powered places with what seems to us a lot more technology than we have, only a small minority of people get a CT scan. The majority of people are turned around in the A&E department and sent home or admitted and so on. So that I think one's got to look at the practicalities of it. But there is no doubt that this ought to make a difference, and landlines from non-specialist units to neurosurgeons or neuroradiologists and so on. So I've no doubt that this should make an impact, but it will only make an impact if they're properly used.
That really brings us to another area, I think, that you've become increasingly involved in, which really revolves around these pieces of equipment or types of technology that cost a lot of money, and in the UK at least are only able to be distributed in certain areas. And what are your feelings about the fairest ways to ensure that, as it were, the Joe public gets the best access to this?
Well, I suppose this, I mean, my interest in this was sparked by my being asked to write a monograph by the Rock Carling lectureship people in London, and they gave me the subject. They said, will you write about the value of high technology? So I had to say, what is high technology? And of course it's diagnostic, it's therapeutic, and I wrote my monograph, which was called High Technology Benefits and Burdens. So I suppose, to answer your question, how do you assess the balance between benefits and burdens? And the burdens are, of course, the human burdens of the unpleasantness of technology, if it is unpleasant, the hazards of it, and the cost of it. The benefits are how much better are people going to be, and that comes down to, does the technology work? Is it really necessary? So that led on to my becoming interested in the American buzzword of technology assessment. And in fact, I became president of the International Society for Technology Assessment. So I became very intrigued at looking at how do things work? How do we know whether things work? even if they work, are they worth the money they cost, and so on. And I suppose I've been most interested in that in the fields of surgery and intensive care, because that's a natural, that's the areas in which we work, the head injuries and so on. And of course the other issues that come in are economics and ethics. And I've done quite a lot of work with health economists and looking at this quality of life and is it worthwhile doing this and so on. And indeed, probably the most recent paper I've written with John Pickard is on the economics of neurosurgery. You know, there are very cost-effective procedures like letting out extradural hematomas, extremely cost-effective. Gliomas and severe head injuries, really, you know, it's almost infinity to gain a quality-adjusted life year from those conditions. So I think now we're getting in a situation where we can begin to look at neurosurgery beside other specialties and actually have a who's worth more business. It won't be enough just to shout and say the brain's important, therefore give me the money. I think the future is going to mean people being much more concerned with outcomes, with cost effectiveness, with does it work. And I welcome this. I mean, I think this makes an interesting intellectual challenge rather than simply a cramping the doctor's style, which is the way some people see it.
Well, I mean, certainly these are a lot of the sort of challenges that are with us, and certainly in the UK where other people are threatening to manage our affairs, I'm sure is the answer. But I mean, throughout this period of your career, you also, and we haven't touched on it yet, I mean, you became Dean of the Faculty of Medicine in Glasgow, and really with all of the responsibilities and the duties that involved. But just really to ask you what you felt about the place of neurosurgery in the training of a medical student at that time, how you felt about that.
Well, I think what we've seen is neurosurgery coming out of the closet, so to speak. I mean, it used to be something that was done in a corner by rather eccentric people for no-hoper patients. I think certainly what I've tried to do is to focus attention on the common conditions like head injury, like lumbar disc disease, the things that really are quite common, strokes and so on. And if you look at these conditions, these are really very common, much more common than the things the professor of medicine teaches them about most of the time. So I think there is a very real place for neurosurgery, stroke neurology teaching and participation in medical education. But I suppose the other thing which my period in the deanship did was to broaden my focus, which is why I suppose at that time I became interested in these broader issues of economics and ethics and effective use of technology, which I think, of course, come into focus in neurosurgery because we are a high-cost specialty. We do deal with ethically awkward problems, many patients who can't consent, or we have to take dramatic action, people who end up in things like the vegetative state, which I described with Fred Plum. These are all economic and ethical issues. So, you know, when people say, well, why does a neurosurgeon get involved in these? I said, well, it seems to be the neurosurgeon is just the very person who, in a way, confronts these kind of things in his daily life, and therefore it's almost a natural that he should be concerned with them.
I mean, that, and so I mean, in dealing with what the undergraduate has to know, what about the postgraduate aspects of being a professor of neurosurgery? I mean, what do you feel have been the contributions of an academic neurosurgeon to the world of neurosurgery in the UK? Well,
I think that when I came to Glasgow, for example, there was very little academic neurosurgery, as we would. The surgeon who wanted to be academic, to do research, to do animal work, he went into general surgery because the professor of surgery was the chap. General surgery was it. Now, of course, general surgery is a residual specialty of what's left when all the specialties have taken their bit off. And one of the things that I think I tried to do, because after all I was brought in by a professor of surgery, was to develop research within the context of the surgical school, if you like, as I think you call it in Edinburgh, and to share laboratories with these people. to recognise the common interest to get into things like the Surgical Research Society, which used to be nothing but gastroenterology. Now I think there is actually a neurosurgical section, and it is seen as probably the next after general surgery to be active in laboratory work. So I think it has changed. I think it's changed quite considerably. It used to be very much a practical thing, word of mouth, small specialty, everybody knew everybody. Nobody looked at very serious research. So I believe it's changed. We've now got half a dozen professors, most of them trained in Glasgow, I might add.
Yes, I think had you not said that, I would certainly have said that you have certainly spread the word. And I think as we come to the end of this interview, it's really the crystal ball gazing bit that we finish on. And I think there's two areas I'd like you to look at the future concerning head injury and high technology medicine. Maybe head injury first. Where do you see head injury going?
Well, I think that neurosurgery started with head injuries, you know, arrow wounds in the Chinese dynasties and Aztec holes in the skull, and it'll end with that because, you know, tumours is going to end up with immunology or chemistry or, you know, it's not going to be hacking it out, I don't think. And I think that trauma will always be with us. There are fewer head injuries thanks to preventive measures, but given man, there'll always be head injuries. So I reckon it's a long-running serial, and therefore we shall always have to deal with it. And so I think there are, of course, emerging now a whole generation of new drugs. So I think the next 10 years is going to be almost a rerun of the last 10 years, but hopefully more effectively managed by neurosurgeons with probably a lot of trials. Are there going to be enough head injuries to go around to do these trials is one of the questions, unless we have some really high-powered international cooperation. And of course, one of the features of our studies has been this setting this scene for international multi-center trials, now done, of course, for aneurysms and so on as well. And I think that will have to continue and be paid for. And so I think that's perhaps the area in head injury as I would see it.
And then high technology medicine, I mean, the very expensive imaging equipment, I mean, do we deserve to have that?
Well, one of my
departments?
aphorisms is that pretty pictures don't save lives. And, you know, radiologists are mesmerized and say, well, that's a much nicer picture than that picture. But I say, what difference does it make to the clinical decision? And I think we're going to be having to face those kind of practical outcome questions. That it isn't good enough just to satisfy the chap looking at the picture or the chap acquiring the machines. And this is all the technology assessment scene that I spoke about a few minutes ago. And I think we are going to have to be more hard-headed in looking at what is the value of this to the patient, to the patient's outcome. Not does it make the practitioner feel better or reassured or more satisfied by having a bigger machine than the chap in the next town. So I think we're in for a much more hard-headed approach, which will be good for patients and good for economics and good for ethics. And I think neurosurgeons will be in the middle of this.
Bryan, one of the things I suppose I learned from you is that if you want to make a point, you have to make it very clearly and issue challenges in such a way that people find it very difficult to argue with the logic of your approach. And I think you've certainly exemplified that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The alternative was